A common theme in Roman Greco writings is the trade routes that connect Africa together, north and south. Now, these are interesting because, of course, people claim that these places were never connected in history. But since there was writing, there is no part in its history to which these places were considered disconnected. As you can see on this map, which is the time of the Ghana Empire, which is slightly after the girl who was discovered, but that time period shows interesting regions where within Algeria there were very deliberate spots of trade moving from places like Sigilamasa, as stated by Ibn Battuta, and places like Tagaza inside of the Ethiopian regions. This oil lamp depicting a Negro is found in Timgad. Timgad is a region located to the north of Algeria. These connectors and the populations that would then be explained by the Romans and the Greeks at the time tell us of a land that was populated by Black Africans who traveled up and down this region. One of them, of course, being the Garamantes. These are the ruins of those very Romans who entered in the area, and you can see that they very much established themselves, and so they were very aware of the populations that surrounded them, describing Berber tribes and how some of them could be very civilized while others were prone to war, describing large scale trade with the lower parts of what they used to call Libya or Greater Ethiopia. But they do not only explain Ethiopians, but instead explain the trade routes of the Ethiopians. One that is explained by Ptolemy, who, if we remember, is in the AD, so a couple hundred years before this girl who has been recently discovered, 13-year-old girl's DNA had recently been discovered, which I saw this map online, and it's a near perfect representation of that type of trade at the time. Of course, there's some that have been ignored. If you notice, Algeria itself is open. And so you can see there the purple line represents 19 BC, and you can see it goes from Sabratha all the way down to Gao. Paulinus, the orangish line, goes all the way from Mauritania down to Senegal. Then you can see Flocus, the light orange line that goes down from Leptis Magna all the way down to Lake Chad, again, showing how connected Africa was in the past. Then Maternus in 90 AD. Okay, this one represents Agassimbia. But remember, there is Ptolemy who writes about Agassimbia, and he writes that the Libyans and the Garamantes make their way around to Agassimbia, connecting Ethiopia or Greater Ethiopia with the upper Libyan Algerian regions. These populations of Black Berbers living in Algeria are so carefully stated that the people who wrote about them and the people who read about them seem to have come to some kind of agreement that the Tuareg represent a later version of the Garamantes. If we can read there, they are semi nomadic people who mostly practice Islam and are descendants from the indigenous Berber communities of northern Africa, whose ancestry has been described as mosaic of the local northern African, Toferot, Middle Eastern, European farmers, and sub Saharan Africans prior to the Muslim conquest of the Maghreb. Some researchers have tied the origin of the Tuareg ethnicity with the fall of the Garamantes who inhabited the Fezzan from the first millennium BC to the 5th century AD Tuareg people are credited with spreading Islam in North Africa and adjacent Sahel regions. So the Tuareg themselves have been seen as one of the biggest populations that existed in between these two areas, the north and the south. And this black population that existed, this Berber Afro-Asiatic speaking population that existed at the time, is seen as part of these giant trade routes. And when the Garamantes, who we all know who they were, as described by Ptolemy and others, fell and they moved on from place to place, it seems as if they got dominated and moved out of their territories in some case. But these populations are still gigantic. Now, how distributed this population is actually interesting because there, of course, are some tribes that have been only recently created, and this is easy to spot because they are not evenly distributed around the world or around their local regions. Whereas the Tuareg of Algiers and all of these other places are distributed within the regions in such a way that it makes sense that they were such a giant population at the time. So you can see there that in Niger, there are about 2.7 million people, which is a very large population. And then in Mali, there's 700,000, which some people speculate they diminished after a while in that population, probably due to some factors. Burkina Faso, 406,000. In Libya, there's 200,000 of them. In Algeria, there's 152,000 of them. In Mauritania, 123,000. And then in Nigeria, 30,000. These are fairly large numbers of people. This should contextualize for us exactly what I'm trying to say when it comes to the African populations acting as intermediaries with those Arabs that lived in North Africa at the time, and prior to that, with the Roman population that lived at the time, who spoke about the Garamantes as well. So some of those empires, like the Kingdom of Ghana, the Kanem, and all of those, seem to be in a result of a broken previous empire, the Garamantes, and then they spread and became these smaller empires. It would explain a lot of why some of these people could organize so easily, especially north and south. When you see in Algeria, the north, there's hundreds of depictions from there where they depict black Africans who seem to belong to one tribe, but they don't necessarily dress the way that you would expect someone who lives in the Sahel to dress. So they dress in this type of way where they're all covered up, they're desert ready. And of course, in the future, people like Ibn Battuta would explain some of these people in a way deeper manner. This is where Taman Rasset comes in. The people living in Taman Rasset, though most of them represent the Arab populations that have lived there now for a couple hundred years, the still population that is 100,000 plus strong is located in that region, and most of them are focused in a particular part of Taman Rasset province of Algeria, in a place called a hugger. Now, we must keep in mind that this information only helps us a little bit because there is more information about where and why these people were around at this point. And remember, the Garamantes were scattered all across the top. So, from Tunisia, as you can see over there, down to Algeria, all the way to Niger, Chad, Mali, and Mauritania. This large Garamanti population, as described by Ptolemy and the others, they didn't describe it as a small population, described it as a large population, which ended at the limits of the other Ethiopians, which, of course, one of the people claimed that and this might be true, that the people, the Garamantes, used to hunt other Ethiopians and then sell them into slavery. Although this was disputed by Ptolemy, saying, first of all, why would he hunt his own people down? Because the Garamantes are so Ethiopian, like themselves, they're Ethiopian, that they are actually part of the same kingdom. It's just two sections of the same kingdom. And then he mentions something else, which he says that Claudius Magna, who is the person who made the allegation, is incorrect because in his head he makes them seem like they're so far apart. In which case, of course, the you could understand why the Ethiopians would run when they see them because they don't see him often. But actually, it seems like that he's saying that the Garamantes were next to the Niger River and even the furthest parts like Senegal, they were next to these places so often that there is no running away. Now, it's important what they said on Wikipedia, where it said it represents the fall of the Garamantes, meaning it represents a shrinking of the populations. The populations, of course, at the time would have been much larger, and the African distribution would have been much larger. Of course, if we include the Moors over there, we're talking about a very, very large amount of people who existed in the area. So we've got the Moors, the Mauritanians, we've got the Senegalese, we've got the Algerians, we've got the Negrits or the Nigerians, we've got the Kanem, and then we have people from Sudan who also seem to have belonged to some of these larger groups. And then, of course, if we're going back, we've got the ancient Egyptians. What then space does it leave for people to communicate outside of Africa? It must be said, though, that the people of Kanem seem to have a sharp difference because of their proximity to Sudan. But this is the same for the people in Algeria. See, the people in the Sahel regions proper are different than the people in Algeria. They're different than the Tuareg because the Tuareg have historical ties with these Roman people as well, which means that their Iron Age sort of matches up with those further in the north, whereas the Iron Age in the Sahel is a little bit different, and when it contributed is a little bit different as well. Also, during the Roman period, they were talking about how these people were wearing all kinds of cottons that cover their faces and stuff. I mean, some of these come back to us from people like Herodotus and stuff like that. So we find early evidence of them utilizing cotton as a fabric, while it's thought that lower south it was maybe harvested a little later. And of course, there's the question about the silk. Although these people practice Islam today, to connect it back to the DNA found in England, and there's something that I didn't state in the previous one, although these people today collectively seem to worship Islam more, obviously they had a original religion existing in the area, which actually is similar to the rest of the Berbers. So a sort of Kabul type religion, which is somewhat related to those in places like Egypt, but with a bend towards others in Nigeria and the rest of West Africa. But before there was Islam, there was the Romans. And the Romans came with Christianity, an international religion. These people who traveled this far also show signs of Christianity being adopted fairly early. Not only do we see oil lamps or writings, which are in the Roman writing styles all over Algeria and Tunisia, including the areas which the Romans had no real control in, but we see a symbol that you can see right at the top. If you look, you see a symbol at the top. This symbol is called the Christogram or the Chiro. This Christogram is a mixture of the letter P and the letter X, this representing Christianity. A lot of these symbols were used in the early days, and it was a visualization of Jesus hanging on the cross. Obviously, since Tunisia was under the Romans in occupation, you will find some of them in Rome. But of course, some of them that we find are from Algeria. And as you can see, this letter, the symbol that we saw in the previous one, representing Christianity and its far extended reaches into parts like Algeria. Now, this is the part that I omitted last time, which it is thought that these people extended to the furthest reaches, including places like England and places like that. So, North Africans, which were doing it voluntarily, were trying to spread Christianity, just like how one of the saints from Egypt under Roman occupation was sent to Europe to also spread the faith. So it would not be surprising to imagine that the people who ended up there, the black people who ended up in England, might have been Christians who were sent by any of these powers living in this region, which were Christian adjacent. So the Berber powers, the Garamanti types, or even the Roman Empire, they could have been sent to continue the spread of the Christian religion and its influence in places as far away as England, especially since it was on the shores. Now, of course, there is the chance that even though these people were Christian and they were probably spreading it to a lesser nation, so in other words, the nations in between North Africa and England, it's possible that they were then doubling down as traders or people like that. And these traders ended up in places like England and stayed there, which again they would have been allowed to, given the fact that they're staying in that location will continue the faith. Which is why it's not a surprise that even as far as Europe and England and Britain itself, we find this symbol in the 6th century, so 500 AD to about 600 AD, we find this same symbol, the which they call chiro, the chi representing the X and the rho, which is the P sign, being depicted in those regions as well. As you can see, also there's a boat probably indicating how Christianity got to this region. It's interesting to know that Christianity could have played a giant role in making the world a smaller place. Now, I must remind you that Christianity was not the first religion to do this, which is why we can find so many populations from around the world in the past coming together at one time in history. International religions barely existed in the past. Most religions had to do with local people. So, for example, the Zulu religion just belonged to the Zulus, the Xhosa religion belonged to the Xhosas, the Namibian religion belonged to the Nama, the people of Congo, their religion was just theirs. Egyptians' religion belonged only to the Egyptians. Nubian religion belonged only to the Nubians, and so on. But with the birth of Zoroastrianism, which was an international religion, we start seeing things like Zoroaster as far as Africa. And then with the birth of things like Judaism, which was another international religion, we see Judaism as far as Ethiopia. With things like Buddhism, we see Buddhism as far as Japan and India and China and the islands located in Asia, even as far as Indonesia. So the theory works in practice as well as theoretically that once you get a religion that is internationally minded, the people are given a type of hype inside of their heart that allows them to grow beyond their borders. Now, one of the things that has been estimated, which was the fall of the early Roman Empire, is the fact that they had disparate religions. So they had separate religions in different areas, which they allowed to exist. But these cults were constantly revolting because they had different opinions. And so having a unified religion means that you have very predictable people. And this advantage was not something that was missed on someone like Constantine, who unified Christianity and tried to move away from the early versions of Christianity, which were sort of different from one another, and wanted to have a unified version of Christianity that he could spread and again have a predictable version of it around the world. This legacy we still to see to this day and was probably seen in that day as well. Now, through the line of Christian Moors, Christian Niger, which was, I don't want to pronounce it because I might get in trouble with the censors, let's say Niger, the people who were Christian, black Christians who were commissioned, remember this Saint Maurice, who was Christian himself under a non Christian Roman Empire. This empire, of course, wanting to reduce the number of them, sent them away. Let's just read the summary version of it on Wikipedia. Maurice became a soldier in the Roman army. By the way, he was born in Egypt under Roman occupation. He rose through the ranks until he became the commander of the Theban legion, thus leading approximately 1,000 men. He was an acknowledged Christian at the time. Early Christianity was considered to be a threat to the Roman Empire. The legion, entirely composed of Christians, had been called from Thebes in Egypt to Gaul to assist Emperor Maximum in defeating a revolt by the Bagadi. The Theban legion was dispatched with orders to clear the great St. Bernard Pass across the Alps. Before going into battle, they were instructed to offer sacrifices to the pagan gods and pay homage to the emperor. Maurice pledged his men's military allegiance to Rome. He stated that the service to God superseded all else. He said that to engage in wanton slaughter was inconceivable to Christian soldiers. He and his men refused to worship Roman deities. Then there's Moses the Black, or Moses the Ethiopian, or Moses the Niger, who started off as a robber and an uncontrollable thief at the time, and then ended up as a Christian saint. And then there is Benedict the Black, or Benedict the Moor, or Benedict the Niger, who started off as a slave and ended up becoming a saint of Christianity. All three of these people have a long history, and I will be making a video on all three of them and why there are so many saints of Ethiopian origin. And this is the part that I wanted to mention, which is the spreading of the religion, the reality that Ethiopians occupied this religion before the Roman Empire and all of these people accepted it, and the fact that these people who were found in those graves might represent a greater Ethiopian Christian expansion that existed. Remember, there was also the Ethiopian person who they thought existed, Prester John, even though there were different names for different kings. And then there's Caleb as well. So Christianity plays a huge role at this time in all of Africa, including parts of the Sahel, which we didn't even know about. And we probably still don't know about today how deep Christianity might have infiltrated in those regions. Because after that, all we see is just Islam taking over. So that is another point of view, and we shall be looking at that later. Thank you. Like, share, and subscribe.